Hello, friends and neighbors. Thanks so much for joining me today. My name is Chris Segrin from the University of Arizona Department of Communication. Today, I would like to speak with you about third-party conflict intervention. What is third-party conflict intervention? Well, this is in a situation where you see two people having a conflict, an argument, they're behaving aggressively toward each other. And third-party conflict intervention is when you, as the third party, try to intervene to stop that conflict or separate those two combatants and restore some peace and order to the situation. Third-party conflict interventions can be very complex and very dangerous in some cases, and in other cases they can go fairly well. Today I'd like to talk with you about some of the actual social scientific research that exists on third-party conflict interventions, telling us how it happens and why it happens. So today we'll talk about what are the third-party conflict interventions, what does this actually entail. We'll also talk about the research on effectiveness of third-party conflict interventions. And finally, we'll talk about the conditions of conflicts that should be considered when making a decision as to whether or not to intervene in another conflict between other people. Let's begin with a basic phenomenon that's associated with conflict. We are often trained to believe through the media, for example, that there's a bad person and a good person, right? And the bad person does something to the good person that's bad, and then they start having a conflict and that kind of thing. In fact, conflicts are not predetermined based on an intrinsic motivation. They're usually co-created in the moment through actions and reactions in the situation as it develops. So conflict is more like a loaf of bread that has yeast and water and sugar in it, and the ingredients all commingle, and the combination of them causes that bread to rise. And then when you put it in the oven, it bakes and it turns into bread. Think about conflict more like that than somebody coming with evil intentions to do bad things to somebody else. I mean, certainly there are situations like that, but by and large, they're interacting responses of action and reaction, action and reaction. Keep that in mind, because when we get involved in third-party interventions, we often don't see the actions and reactions and the actions and reactions. We don't see that chain link of sequences. We maybe only see some of it. We don't see the whole chain. And that puts us sometimes in a very unusual situation to be able to try to bring some order and make some judgments of who really needs the most direct attention here to bring the conflict down a little bit. Let me begin by telling you about a very recent study conducted in Amsterdam by Ernst and colleagues, published in 2022 in the Psychology of Violence journal. And they did an analysis of real-life altercations, one of very, very few studies that actually looked at real-life altercations. This was on the streets of Amsterdam, where they have closed-circuit television cameras, and they analyzed these. Third parties were successful, they found, in de-escalating conflict in 29 of 48 conflict situations that they had caught on camera that met the criteria for analysis. That's about 60%. Those odds aren't terrible. They're not fantastic either. Okay, so you have about, at least in this one study, looking at people on the street, about 60% of the time a third party intervened, it seemed that the conflict was diffused. We'll talk about some of the issues associated with this momentarily. These authors developed a model they call the ideal typical model of de-escalation. 3 phases that seem to take place when a third party is intervening. First, objection. Second, separation. And third, placation. Notice something about these 3 phases of third-party intervention, that they proceed only when necessary. So it doesn't mean that in all cases of third-party intervention, they go phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Phase 2 only is implemented if phase 1 is not successful. Phase 3 is only implemented if phase 2 was not successful. So this is kind of a try this. If it doesn't work, try that. If that doesn't work, try that. Okay, that's how these third-party interventions that were successful worked. It was almost as if someone came to the conflict situation with a bag of tricks, right? And they said, I'm gonna try this trick, and if it doesn't work, I'm gonna grab this one, I'm gonna grab this one. Third-party interventions often need a great deal of flexibility like that, where you have to try things, and if they don't work, try something else, and you have to be persistent. Okay? Let's unpack these in some more detail and see what they're talking about here. First, objection. Obviously, the most low-level intervention in a third-party conflict is objection. Showing your disapproval. Hey, you two, come on, settle down now, that kind of thing. Third parties try to discourage the antagonist from pursuing the conflict further, try to get them to change their behavior rather than physically forcing them. This is done through verbal persuasion, often accompanied by disapproving or arresting gestures like, hey, come on, stop it now. Hey, don't do that, that kind of thing. So you're trying to get a message across through communication channels that are purely verbal and nonverbal without actual physical contact of any sort. A lot of times, now think about this, a lot of times when these were successful, the third-party intervener used authoritative orders, like pointing forcefully, like, hey, you, get out of there, that kind of thing. In other words, they took control of the situation. Sometimes they would move in on the antagonist. Now, I don't necessarily recommend doing that in all situations. You have to remember the context of it. These are conflicts going on the streets of Amsterdam, closed circuit cameras. You can pretty much assume alcohol was involved in a lot of these. And so the interveners themselves may have not been in the clearest of mind and may have been feeling a little bit bold at the moment. But the point is that a lot of the successful interventions involved taking like an authoritative stance toward the two parties who were having the conflict. You may or may not find yourself in a situation where you're comfortable or even able to do that, but that's what the data show for the ones that were able to be resolved effectively in the objection phase. Separation happens when the third parties force the antagonist apart. Typically this is preceded by objection, but in about a third of the cases they found the interveners went right to separation. The first thing they tried to do was just pull the two people apart. Often it relies on physically overpowering the antagonist and forcing them apart, or at least at a minimum putting the self in front of one so that they can't get to the antagonist. Depending on who you are and in what situation you're in, this may not be a possibility or it may be a possibility. But again, here what I'm saying is when we look at what happens out on the streets, when conflicts are getting really hot and the propensity for violence is high, if they were resolved by a third-party intervener through separation, there was some physicality there where they were getting themselves in between the two or literally pulling the person apart, two people apart. And I want to also make clear that that first bullet point, third parties, plural, a lot of times third-party interventions that are successful involve multiple people, and we'll get to that in a moment in some more detail. If those two phases were not successful, the ones that went on to be successful then involve some placation. Sometimes third parties will attempt to calm the separated antagonist down once they get them apart. Just getting them apart doesn't mean, hey, I'm successful, the conflict's over. A lot of times they want to keep fighting with each other or keep arguing. So what is necessary then in a lot of cases is placation. Where basically they try to take them apart from each other, and then they continue to want to fight with each other, and then the third parties have to calm them down using calming touch, distraction, increasing distance, listening, empathic communication, these kind of techniques. I want to point out something very important. The study was done in Amsterdam, and the cultural norms for touch in Europe are somewhat different than they are in America. So for what you're seeing here in this slide, a man puts his arm around the back of another man. In Europe, that would be much more common, and it wouldn't be viewed so much as a violation of personal space to the same extent as it could be in an American culture. So there is an interesting dimension here that I have to mention. Calming touch can be a very, very effective behavior, but it can also go sideways on you really easily if it violates cultural norms. So you have to have some awareness of who you're working with. There's also sex differences in the use of calming touch and so forth that I won't get into at the moment. But what I'm saying is what the researchers in Amsterdam saw on the cameras is very often calming touch played a role in placation along with distraction and increased distance. The distraction behaviors don't necessarily have to address the conflict directly, but sometimes they suggest alternatives, like you might do this instead, or let's go over here, and rather than fight with him, come and talk to me over there. I'm trying to get the antagonist's mind oriented to something other than their co-combatant. Okay, that's the idea of distraction. Placation techniques were often the last phase of the successful third-party intervention. So it started with objection, separation, and then placation. And you may not have to go through all three of them. Some of them were just through objection, or just through objection and separation, the conflict was diffused. But sometimes it has to go all the way through placation as well. Here's an earlier study by Levine et al. This was done in England, and this looked at group size. I told you we were going to talk a little bit about group activity in third-party conflict interactions. In this research study, they had public aggression analyzed, again, from closed-circuit television cameras that were in a city center in England. And the researchers analyzed footage of antagonists fighting in the presence of 2 or more bystanders. That's a key point, 2 or more bystanders. They coded for escalatory behaviors, like hitting, slapping, punching, pushing, shoving, and they coded for conciliatory behaviors that they observed on the videos. These were making open-handed gestures, blocking contact, holding a person back, or pulling 2 people apart. Here would be some examples of screen captures from their actual video footage. Here we have escalatory behavior. The man in the striped shirt is having a conflict with the man in the white shirt. There are indeed 2 or more bystanders here. That closed fist punch, as if like I'm going to hit you, or maybe he even did swing at him for all we know. And then over here, here's the conciliatory behavior of the intervener, the person in the middle, who's now physically separating them. Notice the distance between the 2 here and here, it's greater. Okay, and then we have just an onlooker here in this situation. These are the kinds of scenes that they coded for from this footage in a city center in England. Here's a key point. As the group size increased, so did the conciliatory behaviors of bystanders. Group size seems to be very beneficial to third-party intervention because it's more likely to generate conciliatory behaviors. Backing up for one moment, how would you feel stepping in between 2 people who were coming to blows, fisticuffs, literally, if you were by yourself versus if you were with a group of maybe 3 or 4 others? You might feel more comfortable doing it if you're with others because you might feel like if this goes wrong, they'll jump in and help maybe. That'd be a reasonable assumption versus if it's just me against those 2, that could be pretty dangerous. I may not want to do that. So having multiple people with me makes me more likely to jump in and get involved in those conciliatory behaviors. It's not the behavior they found of a single individual that provides the turning point in human violence. It's really the cumulative response of the third parties to the perpetrator's aggression. That's what determines the trajectory, the cumulative response. I'll try this, and I'll try that, and I'll try it, and you'll try it as well, and we'll work together. This is the idea that collective and coordinated group intervention is more likely to lead to nonviolent outcomes than repeated actions from the same person. That's a key point. If 2 people really want to fight or really want to argue and take it on, and only one person is there to be the referee, it just seems easier to ignore that one person or try to work around them than it is if there's 3 people trying to intervene and referee. See what I'm saying? You create a greater opposing force to the fight or the conflict if there's 3 versus just one person repeatedly saying, don't do this, or trying to hold them apart, and generally could be overpowered by the 2 working together so that they can have their conflict or their fight. Levine et al. Found that there was usually 3 conciliatory acts were required to bring the violence under control. So this is not a one shot, one and you're done kind of deal. This is a activity that you keep doing over and over until it has the desired effect, and that may take a while. Okay, so third-party intervention is rarely going to be successful by a single behavior being performed and then boom, that's the magic solution. It doesn't work that way. It's sort of like a project that has to be worked on. And what kind of project? A group project. This is a very important point to remember. The conflict de-escalations that were successful with third-party intervention were most of the time done with the assistance and the help and the activity of a group of people, not just one person. Hold that thought in your mind. It's a very, very important one. In general, the behaviors of third parties are reactions to and conditional on the behavior of the antagonists. So the antagonists are setting the stage. They're basically in control, and the third parties are reacting to those. The interventions in a fight often take repeated attempts, and they take that perseverance in the face of opposition. You cannot walk into a conflict situation where two people are going at it and think, there's one thing I'm going to do that's going to make this end right away. That's more fantasy than reality. Third parties in the study that were observed in the city center usually had a way of establishing authority in a situation. This is another key point. They would often get in there and act dominating and act aggressive. And they appeared to put up a kind of barrier that supposedly the antagonist probably felt, okay, like the cost of continuing on this conflict is going to get too high, because now I have someone else pushing me around trying to get me to stop fighting, as well as the person I'm trying to fight with. So that's an interesting indicator, because it tells us that you may need in a conflict situation to exert some dominance, some aggressiveness, if you really want to successfully intervene in a third-party conflict. And a lot of times, people may not be willing or able to do that. Sometimes it's the case that a third party who's going to intervene in a conflict has to be willing to apply more physical power to break up the conflict than the antagonists are willing to use to continue it. Now, that's another really important point. Take a good look at the two people who are arguing or fighting and you want to intervene, and ask yourself, am I willing to bring more power to bear on ending this conflict than these two people are to continue it? Because if you want to succeed in a third-party intervention, the research shows that this is indeed often the case. And again, I'll be the first to admit that when you capture fights happening on the streets in closed-circuit cameras in Amsterdam or in London, and it's 2 a.m, there's probably alcohol involved, and people are probably behaving somewhat recklessly, both the combatants as well as the third-party interveners, and maybe put themselves in a dangerous situation, and maybe it worked and they never even realized it, but it can be dangerous all the same. Maybe they weren't thinking very clearly and they just thought, like, I'm going to solve this by jumping into it, but that can actually be dangerous. Because again, to do it, you have to be willing sometimes to wield more power to end the conflict than the combatants are to continue it. It's also important not to get caught up in an all or nothing kind of thinking about intervention. Like, if I do this and it doesn't work, then that's it. It's not worth it. You can start by objection, a low level. I'm not going to get hands-on. I'm not going to get physical in any way. I just want to let people know, don't do that. Here's why. And then work the way up to separation and placation. It's a building process, third-party intervention, when it is successful. It is not an all or nothing venture. Very important to keep that in mind. How does third-party conflict intervention work? Well, it seems to work by facilitating a concession without loss of face. And how does that happen? Well, think about it this way. If you say something to insult me, okay, and my face is threatened, you make me look bad in front of my friends, I want to start arguing with you, maybe even fighting with you. If the conflict is broken up by a third party, I can kind of attribute my withdrawal to the third party, right? It's not like you defeated me, but actually the third party, the stranger, the person I don't even know, intervened and talked me out of having the fight. It's a face-saving exit, and that's a beauty part of third-party interventions. That often they can give the combatants a way out of the conflict without feeling they were defeated by their opponent. And that seems to be how it works. There's some scope conditions to keep in mind, though. Third-party intervention techniques are effective when conflicts have a relatively low intensity. They may be ineffective when there's a high intensity, and they might even exacerbate conflict too. So you have to be very, very careful. If people are already swinging away at each other, it's probably not a best idea to kind of get involved in that because they're already beyond psychologically a level where things like objection are going to help, or separation might put you in harm's way because their goal is to fight with each other. And if you're keeping them from their goal of fighting by separating them, now you've got your own miniature combat going on, and that's not a good situation, of course. Possible responses to third-party interventions. Well, some may view it as unwelcome and unwanted intrusion, and that's another thing to keep in mind. If you're going to come into a situation where you don't really have the ability to establish some kind of authority over the two people who are having the conflict, or at least a kind of equal status, your involvement may be viewed as a nuisance by both of them, and there's always a chance that the two of them could collectively turn on you to get you out of the situation so that they can then get back to fighting, which is kind of ironic that they would get into kind of a temporarily cooperative mode, but that is a possibility. So we always have to be mindful of that too. One of the potentially dangerous things about third-party conflict interventions is that they not only may they not work, but they may be very much unwelcome by the two people who are trying to break up, so to speak. And that may not have the best consequences for them or yourself. On this point, I want to note that there's a considerable amount of danger involved in third-party conflict interventions as a potential. I'm not saying all interventions are dangerous, but they're potentially dangerous because there is so much uncertainty in these contexts. Number one, when we see two people fighting, whether it's verbally or physically, we often don't really know who the aggressor or who the target is, who started it, that kind of thing. What happened before we came on the scene? You could see something where it looks like one person's clearly aggressing toward another person. That one person needs to be stopped. But what you maybe didn't see is that for the 5 minutes before, it was the exact opposite. Okay, so you might be seeing someone's reaction and you think that they're the primary aggressor, but in fact they're reacting, they're actually defending themselves against someone who aggressed against them, but we didn't see that because we came on the scene with it in mid-progress. So when you see a conflict that is already in progress, ask yourself, do I really know who's right and who's wrong here? Who's the aggressor and who's the target? Most of the time you don't, and you just have to admit that. And that may make your efforts at breaking up that conflict, it can complicate it to say the least. Here's another really important point. When people are in a crowd or with a group, and there's two of them having a fight or having a heated conflict, do you know who the allies of those two combatants might be? Maybe they're just walking down the street and there's just other people present and there's no one else there who they're with. Or maybe they're walking down the street and those 10 people on the curb, they're all their best friend and they're ready to jump in if something goes badly in the conflict. You don't know that. And that's another really dangerous element of third-party conflict interventions. If you don't know the players both in the conflict and who are surrounding them, if you're in a group of people, be extremely, extremely cautious. Because what may look like a fight between two people can very quickly turn into a fight involving 10 people. People, when they go out in crowds and they're out, at night going on the streets and whatnot, sometimes travel in big groups, but it may only look like they're 2 or 3 by themselves. But in the periphery, there's all kinds of people who are willing to jump into their aid, and that can also make these very, very dangerous situations. Know that de-escalation efforts may or may not be successful. If two people want to have a fight, simply expressing, I don't want you to have that fight, stop fighting with each other, that doesn't necessarily do anything. It may, if you are in a group of people, if you go through the separation placation phases and you stick with it, you may be having some success, but it may not. And so you have to ask yourself, in a kind of cost-benefit analysis, what is the cost of my attempt to intervene? What's the potential cost and what would be the potential benefit? And that's there's no right or wrong answer to that, but it really ought to be considered before you jump into the fray and really try to break it up. It's natural to want to help people when they're in a bad situation like that and they're having a conflict and they're having a heated interaction, and to try to say, I want to be a peacemaker and bring this down. But be very careful, be mindful of these considerations. Remember that above all else, at the end of the day, you are the primary agent in your own self-protection. Third-party interventions should follow the same principle as what I always call the first rule in hiking, and that is use good judgment. Always have to use good judgment. Take just a moment to size up the situation and see who's with these people. Do I know these people? Do I know how this conflict started? Will they listen to me? Do I have a relationship with them? And so importantly, do I have help of my own that can jump in if things go badly, if I'm going to try to intervene in this conflict? It's a group project, it really is. Here's some recommendations then for when to avoid third-party interventions. I know many people feel and they pride themselves in being peacemakers and they want to settle things down, and it's very attention-getting when two people are having a heated argument and you think, I want to restore some order here. But keep these things in mind. When emotions are running high, that's probably not the best time. I mean really high, like people are they're yelling, they're swearing at each other, they're about to come to blows. Think twice about whether you want to intervene. Your instincts are suggesting to you that the propensity for outbreak of violence is high. Follow your instincts and stay back. Tomorrow is another day, and the greatest victory in any conflict interaction is waking up the next morning ready to carry on the rest of your life. When you have to act alone, when there's no one else there with you, that's an extraordinarily dangerous situation for you. You could get caught in the commotion, in the fray between the two people, or they may view your interventions as unwelcome. That's usually not the best time to intervene. There may be other people present whose relationship with the combatants is unknown to you. Again, a dangerous situation because you might see two people fighting and suddenly it could turn into 7 people fighting and 6 on 1. And that's a very unfortunate situation to be in. So be mindful of that possibility. Also, when you cannot establish authority in a situation, when you see two people and you think there's no way I'm going to be able to go in there and start giving them verbal commands with a reasonable expectation that they're going to listen to me. In these scenarios, you might be better off holding back, maybe seeking help, or seeking allies who could help break up the conflict before you get in. Sometimes the best thing to do if you're in an office building or something is go get a few allies and say, hey, there's a fight going on here, come with me. And then let's see if we can address it. Always start out with talking, the objection, and then go to separation if possible. And separation really requires more than one person. It's very hard to separate 2 people when you're one human being, obviously. We only have 2 hands. And then finally, placation. If you can get the 2 people apart, listen to them, comfort them, calm them down. We have a companion video on conflict de-escalation. We're going into some detail, techniques that you can use for settling down conflicts and bringing the sort of emotional energy way down. I hope you found these interesting and useful techniques and suggestions. Remember, third-party conflict interventions, being a peacemaker can be a great thing. If you can stop 2 people from fighting, that's always a good thing. But it also can come with a lot of risks, and you want to be very careful about sizing up those risks before you just jump right in to try to settle a conflict between 2 people. Thank you very much for joining me today, and be safe.